Welcome back to the channel, where ordinary lives often hide extraordinary darkness. Tonight, we revisit one of the most chilling names in American true crime history, Ted Bundy, the man whose charm masked unimaginable horror. Bundy's story is more than just another tale of violence. It is a story about deception, manipulation, and how evil can wear the most unexpected face. For decades, his name has haunted the world, not only because of what he did, but because of who he seemed to be. He was not the typical image of a criminal. He was intelligent, articulate, even handsome, the kind of man people trusted instantly. And that trust became his most dangerous weapon. In the 1970s, a series of disappearances began spreading fear across the United States. Young women, mostly college students, vanished without a trace from campuses, parks, and quiet neighborhoods. No one suspected that behind the smile of a law student volunteering for political campaigns was a man who would later be called one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. Ted Bundy's ability to appear normal was what made him terrifying. He was the kind of person who could blend in anywhere, a predator hidden in plain sight. Even after his arrest, many refused to believe that someone so seemingly polite could be capable of such cruelty. During his trials, Bundy defended himself, manipulating the courtroom with confidence and arrogance, as if he were performing on a stage. The world had never seen anything like it. But behind the spectacle, there was the reality of unimaginable pain, the lives of innocent victims and their families, forever changed. Bundy's crimes were not just acts of violence. They were deliberate, methodical, and disturbingly personal. His execution in 1989 marked the end of a long and horrifying chapter, yet it did not close the book entirely. Even today, questions remain about the true number of victims, about the psychology behind his actions, and about how someone so outwardly charming could hide such darkness for so long. In this episode, we will begin by revisiting the final chapter of Bundy's story, his capture, his trial, and the day justice was finally served. But as you will see, even the end of Ted Bundy's life did not bring complete closure. His shadow still lingers in America's collective memory, reminding us of a chilling truth. Monsters do not always look like monsters. Sometimes they smile. When Ted Bundy finally confessed, he claimed responsibility for the deaths of around 30 women. That number alone was horrifying enough to make him one of the most prolific killers in American history. But for investigators, psychologists, and even Bundy's own interrogators, the truth never felt that simple. The deeper they looked, the more it seemed that Bundy's confession might only reveal part of the story. During his final interviews before execution, Bundy was calm, polite, and strangely detached. He spoke about his crimes as if describing events that had happened to someone else. At times, he gave small details, names, locations, dates, but often he withheld information, hinting that there were more victims than anyone could imagine. He seemed to enjoy the control that secrecy gave him, even as his own time ran out. The number 30 became infamous, printed in newspapers, repeated in documentaries, carved into the collective memory of the case. Yet many detectives suspected that Bundy's real victim count was significantly higher. Some believed it could be 50, others whispered it might even reach 100. What made things more complicated was Bundy's constant movement across the country. He killed in multiple states: Washington, Utah, Colorado, Oregon, Idaho, and Florida, leaving behind a trail that was almost impossible to connect in the 1970s before modern DNA analysis existed. Even today, decades later, investigators still review missing persons cases from that era, looking for patterns that might match Bundy's method. In some cases, the evidence is gone. In others, it is too damaged to test. But every few years, a new lead appears: a name, a location, a possible match, and the question resurfaces: how many victims were there really? Bundy's intelligence allowed him to manipulate not only his victims, but also the system itself. He used his courtroom appearances to gain attention and, in some twisted way, control his own narrative. Some experts believe his partial confession was deliberate, a final game to keep people guessing, to ensure that his story would never truly end. For the families of the victims, the uncertainty is unbearable. Many never received closure, never found remains, never got the answers they needed. To them, Bundy was not just a criminal. He was a thief of truth, stealing not only lives but also peace. As we explore this part of the story, one thing becomes clear. Ted Bundy's real legacy is not measured only by how many people he killed. It is measured by how deeply he changed the way America sees evil, not as something distant or monstrous, but as something that can smile, speak gently, and walk unnoticed among us. Every story has a beginning, but in Ted Bundy's case, that beginning remains a mystery. Even after decades of research, psychologists, investigators, and criminologists still can't pinpoint exactly when his darkness first took shape. Officially, Bundy's known murders began in the mid-1970s when a string of young women disappeared from college campuses in Washington and Oregon. But many who studied him believe his violent impulses started much earlier, possibly when he was still a teenager. There are stories, fragments of memories, and clues scattered through his childhood that seem to hint at something darker long before anyone knew his name. Bundy grew up in a seemingly normal home in Tacoma, Washington. Outwardly, his childhood looked ordinary. He had a mother who cared for him and a neighborhood where kids played outside until sunset. But later in life, Bundy revealed deep confusion about his own identity. He was raised to believe his grandparents were his parents, and his biological mother was his sister. That revelation reportedly shattered something inside him, a seed of anger and mistrust that never healed. Some neighbors remembered him as a quiet boy who sometimes acted strangely. Others recalled small but chilling moments, an unexplained cruelty toward animals, or a cold stare that made them uneasy. Of course, those memories came only after the world learned who Bundy really was. But it raises a haunting question. Was there always something broken inside him, or did life create the monster he became? Investigators have long suspected Bundy may have committed earlier, unconfirmed crimes. One case often mentioned is the disappearance of Anne Marie Burr in 1961, an 8-year-old girl who vanished from her bedroom in the same town where Bundy lived at age 14. The evidence is circumstantial, but the timeline and geography fit disturbingly well. Bundy always denied involvement, but he also refused to discuss it in detail, a silence that left many wondering. By the time Bundy entered college, the dual sides of his personality had fully developed. He studied psychology, volunteered in politics, and learned to blend in perfectly with the people around him. Yet, behind that polite smile, something sinister was growing, a fascination with control, power, and the illusion of innocence. The early years of Ted Bundy's life remind us that monsters do not always appear suddenly. Sometimes, they evolve quietly hidden behind the mask of normalcy, waiting for the moment when the world will finally see what they have become. As Ted Bundy's crimes came to light, law enforcement across the United States began to realize something horrifying. His killing spree had stretched far wider than anyone first imagined. The more investigators compared notes between states, the more they uncovered a web of disappearances that might all trace back to one man. Bundy's crimes were not limited to one city or even one region. He moved constantly from Washington to Utah, Colorado, Idaho, Oregon, and Florida, blending into new communities, changing names, and leaving behind chaos wherever he went. This made his trail nearly impossible to follow in the 1970s, a time when police departments rarely shared information across state lines. Even after Bundy's execution in 1989, hundreds of unsolved cases from that era have remained open. Young women who vanished without explanation, whose remains were never identified, or whose deaths fit Bundy's pattern too closely to ignore. Forensic experts call these shadow victims those who might have fallen prey to Bundy, but whose stories were lost in time. Some cases stand out. In Colorado, investigators still revisit the disappearance of Julie Cunningham, a young woman who vanished while walking to meet a friend in 1975. Bundy once hinted he had taken a victim in that exact area, describing a location eerily similar to where Cunningham was last seen, but no physical evidence was ever found. Then there are the Utah cold cases, where several women disappeared under nearly identical circumstances, nighttime abductions near college campuses, a charming stranger with an arm in a sling asking for help, a car parked just out of sight. Each detail matched Bundy's known methods. Yet, without DNA or witnesses, these cases remain unresolved. Investigators also explore connections to unsolved murders in Oregon and California, but most of the files lacked the forensic detail needed to confirm anything. Bundy's pattern of moving from state to state allowed him to vanish between jurisdictions, a gap that criminals today can't easily exploit. What makes these cold cases especially haunting is how Bundy used knowledge of geography to his advantage. He chose isolated areas, forests, mountains, lakes, where remains could stay hidden for decades. Many of those regions are still being searched today. Every few years, a hiker, hunter, or construction crew finds bone fragments in the wilderness, and for a brief moment, hope returns that another missing girl's name might finally be known. To this day, no one can say exactly how many victims Ted Bundy left behind. The official record says 30, but the cold cases tell a different story, one that suggests his cruelty reached much further, and that some of his victims are still waiting to be found. When Ted Bundy was executed in 1989, forensic science was still in its infancy. DNA testing existed, but it was far from the powerful investigative tool we know today. Most evidence from Bundy's crimes, hair samples, fibers, bite marks was analyzed using techniques that now seem primitive. For years, investigators believed the physical trail had gone cold forever, but time has a way of bringing hidden truths back to light. In the decades after his death, DNA technology transformed the way investigators approached old cases. With every advancement, the possibility of linking Bundy to previously unsolved crimes resurfaced. Samples once considered useless, a hair follicle, a drop of blood, a trace of saliva, suddenly became potential keys to long-lost answers. One of the most famous examples of this is the Rita Curran case in Vermont. For decades, many speculated that Bundy might have been responsible for her murder in 1971, since he was known to travel through that region at the time. The case went unsolved for over 50 years until modern DNA testing identified a completely different killer, William DeRoos, a neighbor who lived just upstairs from Curran. Bundy's name was finally cleared from that file. That single case revealed something important. The truth about Bundy's crimes is both broader and narrower than legend suggests. While some cases once blamed on him turned out unrelated, others still carry his shadow, and modern forensics continues to test that boundary. In recent years, law enforcement agencies have begun revisiting cold cases from Washington, Utah, and Colorado, comparing old evidence to the DNA profiles preserved from Bundy's confirmed murders. It is a slow, meticulous process. Many of those samples are decades old, fragile or incomplete. Still, every small discovery can reshape the timeline of Bundy's life. Beyond the lab, Bundy's story has also inspired a new generation of forensic scientists and behavioral experts. They study not only the crimes but also the failures, the missed opportunities, the lack of communication between jurisdictions, the limitations of 1970s forensics to ensure such oversight never happens again. In a way, Bundy's legacy indirectly strengthened criminal science itself. Today, Bundy's DNA profile remains archived in multiple state databases. Anytime unidentified remains or old crime scene evidence surfaces, it is checked against his record. Most come back negative, but every now and then a new lead sparks fresh debate. Did Bundy leave behind more victims than we know, or have his crimes finally been fully uncovered? Even with today's technology, the answers do not come easy. But each test, each new discovery, brings us closer to the truth, one sample at a time. When Ted Bundy confessed to killing 30 women, it shocked the world. But for many experts who studied his behavior, that number never made sense. 30 seemed far too neat, far too controlled for someone who lived a life driven by obsession, impulse, and opportunity. Over the years, investigators, criminologists, and even Bundy's own prison interviewers began to suspect the truth might be far more disturbing. Bundy traveled constantly from Washington to Oregon, Utah, Idaho, Colorado, and finally Florida, crossing thousands of miles in just a few years. In every state, there were unsolved disappearances of young women who fit the same profile: college-aged, intelligent, kind, and often last seen helping a polite man with an arm in a sling or a fake cast. This pattern suggested a level of activity that 30 victims could not possibly represent. In 2023, criminologist Matt DeLisi from Iowa State University reignited this theory. After reviewing decades of case files and studying Bundy's movements, DeLisi concluded that Bundy's true victim count might have been as high as 100 or more. His reasoning was simple. Bundy was highly mobile, extremely organized, and capable of hiding his crimes in multiple jurisdictions. The absence of modern coordination between states during the 1970s gave him the perfect cover to continue killing undetected. Bundy himself often seemed to enjoy feeding the mystery. In one of his final interviews before execution, he hinted that the official number was only a fraction of the truth. He offered no specifics, no names, no dates, just enough to keep investigators guessing. It was manipulation even in his final hours, ensuring that the legend of Ted Bundy would never fade completely. The psychology behind Bundy's selective confessions fascinated experts. Some believed he deliberately held back information to maintain a sense of control, even as his life ended. Others thought it was a final form of punishment, denying closure to families, keeping secrets as his last act of power. But beyond speculation, the idea of 100 victims reflects something deeper about human nature. Bundy thrived on the illusion of control over people, over his own story, and even over history. By leaving his full count uncertain, he ensured that he would never be fully understood, never neatly categorized. He became, in a sense, his own final mystery. Today, investigators still cross-check old missing persons databases with Bundy's travel records. New technology, better data sharing, and DNA testing have brought a few families closer to answers, but many others remain in the dark. Whether the number was 30, 50, or 100, the tragedy remains the same. Each victim was a life cut short, a story untold, and a reminder that even decades later, Ted Bundy's shadow still reaches far beyond his grave. When Ted Bundy finally stood trial, the world expected to see a monster. Instead, they saw a man who smiled, spoke politely, and addressed the court with perfect confidence as though he were the one in control. His charm, once used to lure victims, now played out in front of cameras and judges. What unfolded in those courtrooms during the late 1970s and 1980s was unlike anything the American justice system had ever witnessed. Bundy refused to let anyone else speak for him. He insisted on serving as his own lawyer, a decision that seemed reckless at first, but soon revealed his need for dominance. He cross-examined witnesses, challenged police reports, and even questioned survivors who had escaped his attacks. The courtroom, in Bundy's mind, was not just a place of judgment, it was his stage. Journalists at the time described his behavior as bizarrely confident. He would smile to the jury, flirt with reporters, and act as though the trial were merely a debate he planned to win. He used his intelligence as a weapon, turning legal proceedings into psychological games. Some jurors later admitted they were momentarily swayed by his calm demeanor, a chilling reminder of how easily Bundy could disguise the truth. Perhaps the most infamous moment came during the Florida trial in 1979, when Bundy suddenly proposed marriage to his girlfriend, Carol Ann Boone, right there in the courtroom. Under Florida law at the time, a verbal proposal made in front of a judge counted as a legal marriage. The move shocked everyone, Boone accepted, smiling proudly, while Bundy faced charges for horrific murders. It was theater mixed with madness, a final show of control over both his narrative and the public's attention. Behind the spectacle, though, the evidence was overwhelming. Hair fibers, bite marks, eyewitness testimonies all pointed directly to him. As the walls closed in, Bundy's mask began to crack. His speeches became more desperate, his charm less convincing. When the verdict was finally read guilty on all counts, he barely reacted, but his eyes told a different story, the calm of a man who had lost control for the first time. Psychologists later described Bundy's courtroom behavior as a rare combination of narcissism and psychopathy, a man who believed he could outthink the system, even as it crushed him. His ability to manipulate others even while facing death showed just how dangerous his charisma truly was. The trials did not just convict Ted Bundy, they exposed him. For the first time, the world saw the contradiction in full view, a man who looked civilized, educated, and charming, yet represented pure cruelty behind that smile. After years of investigation, 3 separate trials, and countless appeals, Ted Bundy's fate was sealed. By the late 1980s, he was sitting on death row at Florida State Prison awaiting execution. But even then, Bundy was not just another condemned man. He had become a national obsession, a name whispered in fear, fascination, and disbelief. The media swarmed every update of his case. Reporters described him not only as a killer, but as a strange celebrity of darkness. Documentaries, interviews, and news specials followed his every word. America had never seen anything like it. A man capable of unimaginable cruelty who looked like the boy next door. His calm, articulate interviews made people uneasy. He did not seem like a monster, and that contrast is what terrified everyone most. While imprisoned, Bundy continued to manipulate those around him. He granted selective interviews, speaking in vague riddles, dropping cryptic clues about other victims he had never been charged for. Each confession came with hesitation, as if he enjoyed deciding how much truth to reveal. Some investigators said he was bargaining for more time, offering fragments of information to delay his execution. Others believed he simply wanted to maintain control, even as his world shrank to a single prison cell. Outside the prison gates, the world waited. News cameras set up around the clock. Protesters gathered, some demanding his death, others opposing capital punishment. And in a strange, disturbing twist, a group of admirers began sending him letters, photos, and love confessions. They saw in him a tragic figure rather than a killer. This phenomenon, later called Bundy's cult of fascination, revealed something unsettling about human nature: the ability to confuse charisma with innocence. In his final days, Bundy spoke about the influence of violent media on young minds, perhaps trying to shift the narrative or earn sympathy. But few were convinced. The families of his victims had waited too long for justice. On January 24, 1989, as dawn broke over Florida State Prison, Ted Bundy was led to the electric chair. Outside, crowds cheered as news of his death spread. Some held signs reading, "Burn, Bundy, burn." It was a grim ending to one of the darkest stories in American history. Yet even with his death, Bundy's legacy did not fade. Books, documentaries, and psychological studies continued to examine his life, searching for answers how a seemingly ordinary man could hide such darkness for so long. Ted Bundy's execution may have ended his life, but it did not end the fascination. In a strange way, his story became immortal, a mirror held up to the world, forcing us to see that evil does not always come with a warning. Sometimes it smiles for the camera. When the name Ted Bundy first appeared in headlines, America saw him as an anomaly, a handsome, well-spoken man who shattered every stereotype of what a murderer should look like. But in the years after his death, Bundy became much more than a headline. He became a case study, the benchmark for understanding how a charming, intelligent individual could live a double life, filled with unimaginable cruelty. Before Bundy, the idea of a serial killer was not widely understood. Law enforcement agencies often treated murders as isolated events, never realizing that the same person could commit similar crimes across multiple states. Bundy's case helped expose the gaps in coordination between police departments, and it became one of the reasons the FBI began building what is now known as the Behavioral Analysis Unit BAU, a team dedicated to studying criminal behavior patterns. Bundy's personality fascinated psychologists because he embodied contradictions. He could appear gentle and polite while harboring violent fantasies. He could show emotion when it benefited him, then turn cold and expressionless moments later. Experts labeled him a high-functioning psychopath, someone capable of blending perfectly into society while feeling little or no empathy. His case also shaped how investigators now approach forensic psychology and criminal profiling. Agents like Robert Ressler and John Douglas, who interviewed Bundy in prison, used his insights to create psychological frameworks for identifying future offenders. Bundy even provided advice during active investigations, helping police understand how killers think, choose victims, and hide evidence. It was a disturbing collaboration, the hunter learning from the predator. Bundy's manipulation extended beyond the crimes themselves. He manipulated the media, his defense attorneys, and even his admirers. He thrived on attention, proving that control and recognition were as satisfying to him as the crimes he committed. This understanding of narcissistic psychopathy became a cornerstone of modern profiling, used today to analyze behaviors in countless other cases. More importantly, Bundy's case taught investigators and the public that evil often hides behind ordinary faces. It broke the illusion that killers are always obvious or visibly unstable. The man who held doors open for strangers, smiled in interviews, and spoke eloquently in court was the same man who committed acts of unimaginable brutality. His story transformed not only the justice system, but also the public consciousness. Terms like psychopath, sociopath, and serial killer entered mainstream language because of him. Today, nearly every major case involving a manipulative or calculating offender draws comparisons to Ted Bundy, the man whose crimes rewrote how society defines danger. In a way, Bundy's greatest impact was not just through what he did, but what he revealed. He forced humanity to confront an uncomfortable truth, that monsters can look like anyone, and that understanding them is the first step towards stopping them. More than 3 decades after Ted Bundy's execution, his story is still alive, not in the man himself, but in the endless search for answers that followed him to the grave. Every few years, Bundy's name resurfaces in new documentaries, podcasts, or forensic breakthroughs. Each time, the same question returns. Have we truly uncovered everything about Ted Bundy? In many ways, Bundy's case continues to evolve because of technology. Modern DNA analysis, genealogy databases, and cold case reinvestigations keep reopening doors that once seemed permanently closed. Across the American Northwest, detectives quietly test old evidence, hair fibers, bone fragments, items long forgotten in police storage, comparing them to Bundy's preserved DNA profile. Most results come back inconclusive, but sometimes a small clue emerges. A partial match, a connection to a region Bundy once visited, or a case with identical methods. These discoveries do not always lead to confirmation, but they remind investigators of something unsettling, that Bundy's reach might still extend beyond the list of his known victims. For families of the missing, every new test brings a flicker of hope that maybe, at last, a name can be restored to a lost face. Outside of the lab, Bundy's image continues to haunt popular culture. From films to Netflix series, his story has been retold countless times, each version searching for a different angle, The psychology of manipulation, the failures of law enforcement, or society's dangerous fascination with evil. While these retellings keep his name alive, they also raise ethical questions. At what point does awareness turn into obsession? Some survivors and victims' families have spoken about this, reminding the world that behind every headline was a real person, a daughter, a friend, a life with dreams cut short. For them, Bundy is not a symbol or a story. He is a wound that never fully healed. Yet, researchers continue to study him not to glorify, but to understand. His case still helps train behavioral analysts, forensic psychologists, and criminal profilers. Bundy remains an example of what happens when intelligence and manipulation are used without empathy, a warning about the thin line between charm and danger. Even now, in 2025, Bundy's name still appears in newly declassified files and DNA databases. Each discovery sparks debate. Did we finally reach the end of the story, or is there still something buried in the shadows he left behind? Ted Bundy's story may never have a final chapter. It exists between fact and mystery, a ghost from the past reminding us that evil does not fade easily. It adapts, it lingers, and it continues to teach us that behind every calm smile, there might be something we will never fully understand. The Ted Bundy case did more than terrify a generation. It changed the way law enforcement works forever. When Bundy began his killing spree in the 1970s, the American justice system was not prepared for someone like him. There were no national databases, no coordinated task forces, and no standardized way for police departments in different states to share information. That failure allowed Bundy to move freely, crossing state lines and starting over each time suspicion grew too close. For years, investigators in Washington, Utah, Colorado, and Florida were chasing the same man without even realizing it. The lack of communication between jurisdictions gave Bundy a deadly advantage. He could charm his way out of encounters, relocate, and continue killing under new aliases. By the time the pieces finally connected, dozens of lives had already been lost. After his arrest, and the shocking scope of his crimes became public, law enforcement agencies nationwide began reforming their systems. One of the most significant outcomes was the creation of centralized crime databases and interagency coordination units. Eventually, the FBI's National Crime Information Center, NCIC, and the Behavioral Analysis Unit, BAU, became essential tools, allowing investigators to track patterns, compare evidence, and recognize similar methods across state lines. Bundy's case also forced a deeper look into how evidence was collected and preserved. Many of the missed opportunities in his investigation came from lost or contaminated evidence items stored without proper care, samples left untested. These mistakes led to new standards in forensic procedures, ensuring that even small traces like hair, fibers, or fingerprints would never again be discarded. But perhaps the most important lesson came from understanding the psychology of manipulation. Bundy's charm fooled everyone, his friends, colleagues, even some police officers. He did not fit the typical image of a criminal, which led many to underestimate him. His case taught investigators that evil does not always look threatening. It can smile, it can dress well, it can hold a law degree. From that point on, profiling expanded beyond physical evidence, focusing on behavior, personality traits, and subtle signs of deception. The tragedy of Ted Bundy became a catalyst for progress. His crimes inspired training programs in victimology, criminal profiling, and forensic psychology disciplines now considered essential to solving complex cases. Every generation of law enforcement learns about Bundy not just as history, but as a warning. In the end, the system that failed to stop him also learned from him. Bundy's story forced America to confront its blind spots, the price of underestimating intelligence in the service of evil. From his darkness came reform, and from his crimes came knowledge that continues to save lives today. The story of Ted Bundy is not just about a man who killed it, is about the illusions he shattered, the lives he destroyed, and the lessons he left behind. More than 3 decades after his execution, his name still echoes through classrooms, police stations, and late-night documentaries. But beyond the shock and the horror, there is something deeper, a reflection of how fragile our understanding of human nature can be. Bundy forced the world to look at evil differently. Before him, people imagined killers as outcasts, visibly dangerous, strange, or unstable. But Bundy did not fit that mold. He was handsome, articulate, ambitious. He volunteered in political campaigns, studied law, and blended seamlessly into everyday life. He proved that monsters do not always look like monsters, and that is what makes them truly frightening. His crimes exposed the cracks in society's assumptions. He used politeness as a weapon, empathy as bait, and intelligence as a mask. The idea that someone so ordinary could hide something so dark changed everything from how investigators profile suspects to how people interpret the warning signs of manipulation. For the families of his victims, closure has always been complicated. Many never found the remains of their loved ones. Some never heard Bundy admit the truth. The pain he left behind stretched far beyond the headlines, into decades of grief and unanswered questions. Every photo of him smiling in court reminds them not of fascination, but of loss. Yet Bundy's story continues to serve a purpose. It teaches new generations of detectives and psychologists what to look for and what to never ignore. His case became a foundation for modern behavioral profiling, helping law enforcement prevent future tragedies. In a grim irony, the man who took so many lives also helped save others by forcing the world to evolve. But for all the analysis, there is one truth that will never change. Ted Bundy was not extraordinary because of his intelligence or his charm. He was ordinary. And that is what made him terrifying. His ability to appear normal was his greatest disguise, reminding us that evil often hides in plain sight. As we close this story, we remember not the man, but the lessons. We remember the victims' young women who never got to finish their stories. We remember the progress born from pain, the reforms shaped by tragedy, and the warning that remains as relevant today as it was half a century ago. Never let the face of normalcy fool you. Evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it smiles, shakes your hand, and disappears into the crowd. This is the legacy of Ted Bundy, not in his crimes, but in the truth he forced the world to see. And so, we reach the end of one of the darkest and most studied stories in modern history. The story of Ted Bundy, a man who became both a warning and a mystery. His crimes shocked the world, not only because of their brutality, but because of the way they forced us to rethink what we thought we knew about danger, trust, and human nature. Bundy was not a shadow lurking in alleyways. He was the man who held doors open, smiled politely, and pretended to care. He was living proof that evil does not always hide in darkness. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, behind intelligence, charm, and a well-pressed suit. That realization forever changed the way society understands crime. His story is a haunting study of contrasts, brilliance used for destruction, confidence, masking fear, and empathy twisted into manipulation. For decades, psychologists, detectives, and journalists have tried to dissect what made Bundy who he was, whether it was trauma, narcissism, or something unexplainable. Yet perhaps the most unsettling truth is that there is no single answer. Evil does not always have logic. Sometimes it just exists. But beyond the horror lies another part of the story, one about learning, adaptation, and resilience. Bundy's crimes led to new laws, better forensic systems, and improved communication between states. His manipulation pushed psychologists to develop new frameworks for understanding sociopathic behavior. Even his mistakes taught investigators what not to overlook and how easily charm can cloud judgment. Most importantly, his victims, though their lives were stolen, are not forgotten. They are the real reason this story continues to be told. Each name, each face, each family serves as a reminder of why justice and awareness matter. When we remember Bundy's crimes, we must also remember the courage of the survivors, the determination of the detectives, and the families who never stopped searching for truth. Ted Bundy's story is not just about the evil of one man. It is about the consequences of ignoring what hides behind appearances. It reminds us to stay vigilant, to question what seems too perfect, and to trust our instincts, because in the end, the world does not change only by catching monsters. It changes by learning how to recognize them before they strike. So, as we close this chapter, we do not celebrate him. We learn from him. We speak his name, not to glorify it, but to remember the lessons carved into history by his crimes. Evil can disguise itself as ordinary, but awareness, compassion, and truth, those are what keep it from winning. Thank you for joining me through this difficult but important journey. If you found this story meaningful, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the mysteries that shaped our world. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember, the scariest monsters are often the ones that look just like us.